Those of you who may be regular listeners of the Alex Jones Show will know Alex loves heavy metal. But also, he kind of freaked out the end of last week when I didn't show up for work. I missed 4 days of work. I don't think I've ever missed 4 days of work in an entire 5-year span I've been here. And here I missed 4 days in a row. I was in pain, in bed. My lymph nodes were swollen. I couldn't get up. I couldn't move. I had a very low-grade fever. And I went to the doctor. He looked me over and said, I don't know what you have. You could have West Nile. You could have Zika. I don't know. Because they don't know half the time. They don't know. They just go, oh, it's a virus. You know what? He prescribed me some antibiotics and some anti-inflammatories, which that did work. He called it Super Advil. And that did work. But it helped take down the inflammation. But he doesn't know what I have. And that's why we have our next guest here. She's the author of America is Infected. Her name is Daniela Grace. That is her pen name because she's, well, maybe I'll let her get into that a little bit later. But her son developed a condition, and of course, doctors don't know. They can't tell you what it is. They say it's ADHD. And here we have, this is from last year, Mother Jones, February 24th. The sales of ADHD meds are skyrocketing, and here's why. Obamacare and new diagnostic criteria for adults could mean a major windfall for the makers of ADHD drugs. This is what they pushed on here. There's the headline again right there, and I'll scroll to this, which, oh, it's just a $12.9 billion market right now, and it'll be $17.5 billion by 2020. They have an incentive to push this crap on you, which is basically what legalized speed. How you doing today, Ella?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. So tell us, I guess, start at the beginning. What happened with your son? You were on your way. You're a spa owner. And you had living out the American dream with a small business. And then what happened to your son? What's going on in your family?
My son had a strep infection. And about 2 weeks later, he came down with intense psychiatric symptoms. Within 3 days, he was feeling like spiders were crawling on him. He had an acute case of OCD. He was in the corner, hiding, fearful, terrified. We didn't know what was going on. We contacted the PCP multiple times. Like you mentioned, we don't know. He's probably playing hide and go seek. Of course, I would know if my own son was playing hide and go seek. So ultimately, we ended up taking him to the ER. Mm-hmm. They did some tests, admitted him, ran an MRI, couldn't really find anything, but did some antibiotics, and he got better. They sent us home with a prescription for Zoloft and told us to take him to therapy. The whole time I'm thinking, this is crazy. Zoloft for strep. So the next few years, this went on, up and down, trying to listen to the PCP. But exactly like you just said.
And what does PCP stand for?
Primary care physician.
Oh, primary care physician. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Or pediatrician in this case. And, you know, but never fear. You can always have more ADHD medications, but you can't have what you really need, or they don't spend enough time to figure out what's really going on. And so basically things got worse and worse. And it's similar. This condition is called pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with strep. But nobody would ever really call it what it was or didn't really know how to treat it. Unbeknownst to me, it's extremely controversial, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Mm-hmm. But basically, we just muddled through. We figured out, basically, when he got into 7th grade, that even different viruses would cause him to what we call, in these kids, flare. A spike in psych symptoms or behavioral problems, and the pressure was on from school officials, from everyone around me to boundaries.
Get him on some meds.
Get him on some meds.
Give him some pills.
Give him some pills. Take him to therapy. You're a bad mother. It's got to be something you're doing in the house. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to quit traveling. I'm going to quit consulting. I'm going to lock this thing down. I'm going to implement total transformation. I'm going to be this perfect mother. And I did. And we worked on that for a year, day in and day out, when he was exposed to strep the second time. And at that point in time, he went off the rails. And that is when I'm going to get into the juvenile courts got involved. The judge tried to take custody from me. It was a complete nightmare. But parallel to what was going on with him, I was also having symptoms, like tingling in my hands and feet. I worked out all the time. I'm a spa owner. I have a certification from the American College of Sports Medicine. I have a biology degree. I know how to eat right. I am healthy. I've always been healthy. And to have these kind of symptoms, of course, I was distracted from them by what was going on with my son, but my hair started to fall out. I had a finger break that wouldn't heal. I mean, they were all like kind of odd symptoms, and none of which was clear enough to the neurologist that I was sent to or the rheumatologist. They didn't know. And I was just like, what is going on? When we fast forward to when we got involved in the juvenile courts, when you go to juvenile court, you will try to tell them what is wrong and what you need, but they will not help you. So don't ever go there. But they will give you a laundry list of additional things that you need to do that you've already done.
In order to keep your children.
In order to keep your children that you already did 4 years ago.
And they assign a minder to you to oversee everything and make sure you're being a good parent.
Because you're completely incompetent and you didn't think to take their cell phone in 2009 before any of this happened. Because you don't know how to parent. So we get into this, and there was a new diagnostic test available that came out for the syndrome that he has in July. We got involved in the courts in June. This is a month later. We get back a positive diagnosis. We go to the courts. Listen, there's something wrong with him. Now he's super advanced. We need this IVIG. He needs all new antibodies for this autoimmune disease of the brain that nobody knows what to do with. And so basically, they don't care. They don't want to hear it. They do not want to hear it. They scoffed at me when I tried to explain to them what was going on, what he needed, the best interest of the child. Not at all. They locked him up in cell for days at a time. I'd go get him, bring him back. Any little violation, like if he's out past 7, you can't have any electronics.
And how old is he by this time?
By this time, he was 13,
okay.
And he had not even been treated for the first strep infection correctly, much less the second one. He's completely out of control. It's like me trying to manage Old Yeller on a piece of yarn. Yeah. It's just impossible.
And what was the name of the diagnosis they gave him eventually?
Ultimately, he had PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with strep. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that, but that evolves into something called pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndrome, which involves exacerbation of symptoms with viruses. And it can also be like any kind of addition of chemicals or toxins in the system through foods, everything we hear about, but everything in the world.
Basically,
allergies.
Your environment's attacking you, and this is how the body's responding.
And his, instead of a flare like with rheumatoid arthritis where your knees hurt, he went crazy. I mean, basically had psychiatric symptoms. And nobody could understand it. Nobody got it. He didn't sleep for days on end. But he's a great kid. In between flares, he's awesome at guitar. He's very smart, very handsome, just a great kid. Just so tragic to watch your child going through this.
But because he wasn't taking ADHD medication, you were being a bad parent, essentially.
Because
that's how you were being treated.
He wasn't taking his Zoloft, or he wasn't this, or he wasn't that.
Well, incidentally, I put up an article here. Zoloft, no better than dummy pill, says lawsuit. This is from 2013. Pfizer was being sued. So, they're trying to push this stuff on you and mandate it like they are trying to mandate vaccines now. Now, was he vaccinated, fully vaccinated?
He was fully vaccinated, and here is what helped me ultimately, is once we got into the court system, I tried to take him for brain rehabilitation. He went and he got the IVIG. He got 500 milligrams of steroids for the anti-inflammatory, but it was way too much. At one time, he was way too advanced, and he ended up back in the juvenile detention facility. She put him in isolation for 5 weeks.
Jeez.
Solitary confinement at barely 14.
That doesn't mess you up at all.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. So basically, that just really got me motivated to figure out what was going on. In the meantime, I had been diagnosed with something called reflex sympathetic dystrophy, some kind of random, never-ending pain arc. Then I was supposed to eventually commit suicide because I was never going to get better. There was no cure. I was doing nerve blocks, Cymbalta, psych meds for anxiety. And I was like, I can't keep up with all this. Yeah. So I'm like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. So I go back to work at the spa, and I start to ask questions. I start to ask my clients questions. I start to notice things. I start to look at family systems and dogs and grandparents. And I mean, I was just obsessed with figuring this thing out because it didn't make any sense. And ultimately, it took me, I guess, maybe several months. We started working with a doctor up in New Jersey that was very helpful, ran the lab work. The only thing that came back on my son's labs was a mycoplasma infection. What is mycoplasma? So I started diving deep into mycoplasma. He had some antibody issues, which is typical in autoimmune stuff. So I started digging into the mycoplasma, digging into it. And I realized there's not any research on mycoplasma from American researchers since 2004. So I'm thinking, what's going on?
Why is that?
There's some over in India from 2010.
Yeah.
So everything I can get my hands on, I'm just reading it night and day, night and day. In the meantime, I'm trying to keep custody of my child. Thankfully, I found this amazing attorney that understood CPS and juvenile courts and helped me with that so that I could keep custody. So I started to get a handle on what's going on here. I need to go to the immunologist. I need to take him to infectious disease. Go back to a different pediatrician. Maybe it was that pediatrician. Same thing. I'd like to go to this doctor and this doctor. No, we're going to send you to the endocrinologist and the infectious disease doctor, but we're going to make some little smart aleck comments in the notes so that by the time you get there, they think you're crazy. And, you know, you can get wherever you need to go like that.
Because the state knows best.
Because they know best.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I ended up figuring out what it was. And it was a horrible, horrible answer. But it is what it is. And when I found the story of Dr. Nicholson and how there had been bioweapons testing done in the Texas prison systems, no less, back in the 80s, that was covered up, I knew right then where we had contracted this organism and how it had spread not through just our family, but also to others outside of our family. I came to understand why everyone I had ever known either came down with breast cancer, autoimmune diseases, went crazy, like this long life of all of these just really, you would think, things that just wouldn't happen to the same person. But ultimately come to find out we were carriers, we were vectors, we were being used to spread this organism. And until we got on the treatment for this genetically modified bacterial infection, we were not going to get better. But we have been doing the treatment now for 18 months, and we are all much better.
Well, and so it's you were having fallout from what chemical weapons testing they were doing on prisoners in Texas prisons? Biological
weapons testing back in the 80s. And there is a patent for this particular organism I'm speaking of filed by the head researcher of the United States Army Pathology Lab back in 1993. This organism is called pathogenic mycoplasma. There was a lot of different testing, and I won't get into heavy, but in the book it goes there. Basically, they genetically modified this organism. They made it heat resistant, more immunosuppressive. They actually wove some of the DNA of specific viruses into the genome of this bacterial infection.
So it could grab other things and make them stronger.
It can flare. It can show this. So it's like a Russian cocktail.
Right.
And so it started to spread in the 80s. It started to, the prisoners came down with ALS, MS, rheumatoid arthritis.
Right.
It has spread.
Basically any kind of degenerative nervous system disease.
All this crazy stuff from there. It has just spread. It's like a epidemic, and it is everywhere.
So did you work in the prison system, or how do you think you contracted?
Our brother-in-law was in the Texas prison systems, and we let him come stay with us back in 2002, doing the right thing. I'm getting back on his feet.
Right.
And by looking through all of my son's medical records, I was able to pinpoint it.
That's about when it started?
That is when the symptoms started, but they start with OCD.
Right.
They start with ADHD.
Yeah.
They start with problems breathing, headaches,
That's the level
hair loss.
one, and then it goes up.
And it just goes. And it is true that stress exacerbates the symptoms. It is true that the chemicals in our food exacerbates the symptoms, but this organism lives inside of our cells. And so basically when we have hormone fluctuations and all of these things in our bloodstream, it causes a chemotaxis effect and causes these organisms to burrow deeper into the tissue where they've colonized. So it is scary, but there is a treatment.
Oh my goodness. And you basically found out all this by doing your own research, not depending on the medical model, the prescribed medical model to find out what was wrong, because they weren't going to tell you anything.
In fact, we had to find it in my dog. And
Really?
I fired the pediatrician, and I identified every specialist we might need to go to. I went to at least 7 different doctors for my son, at least 4 different doctors for myself. I just listened to each one of them, and at the end of the day, none of them knew. I took my dog to the vet. I requested a polymerase chain reaction test and from Klongen Labs, and the vet did it. I figured he wouldn't know not to do it.
So here on screen, I have immed.org. In the 1980s, the city of Huntsville, Texas, most of the employment was the local state prisons. In the East Texas town, there was a dramatic increase in neurodegenerative, autoimmune, and fatiguing illnesses that were linked to the employment at the local prisons. Although unproven, it was likely this increases in towns like Huntsville were, wow, back in the 80s, they were finding this. And this has to do with, I guess, what were they injecting this into prisoners, or were they just putting it out in the air?
It's airborne.
It's airborne. So they were just putting it into the air conditioning ducts or the ventilation system.
Yes, and then the wardens and the visitors. And,
sure, everybody gets it.
And then it just started to spread. And by this point in time, the head virologist at, well, name names, but said that probably most Americans are carrying some strain of this by now. Even if it's maybe less virulent or if it's kind of mutated out of its pathogenicity. But at my sickest point, I was down, I looked like I had HIV.
Well, how does somebody go and find out that they have this mycoplasma? Is it mycoplasma? Mycoplasma in their system. How do they find that out? What tests are out there?
There is a polymerase chain reaction test. It's a nasal swab. And you can ask your doctor to do it for you. And he probably won't, but you could ask.
He'll probably think you're crazy for asking.
I mean, yes.
You show him the documents. You know, here, look, they were testing this. Everybody's got it. We're in Texas.
Yes.
Please test me.
Test me. And then you overnight it to Clongen Labs and look for the mycoplasma species. And then they'll tell you the treatment is something different than it really is. So make sure you get the real treatment from this website as well. Wow.
Well, and, you know, we don't like to tell people, you know, because I'm not a doctor. All I tell people to do is read the damn vaccine insert, and you won't want to inject these things into your kids. And, you know, of course, I was fully vaccinated. My kids are being spared that fate. But your book, America is Infected, where can people go to find it? And it's got everything that you had to go through, all your trials and tribulations. And
all the doctor's visits, what they said, what I asked, what we found, what tests to run, what treatments we did. Yes. Go to americaisinfected.com and click the add to cart or buy now, whatever the button says at this point in time.
That is
we
amazing.
Will get it shipped.
And, you know, this kind of reminds me of was the story Lorenzo's Oil. You know, this kid's dying in bed. They can't figure out what's wrong with him. His dad goes in, but this is before the internet. And he's in these medical libraries, and he develops an oil that reverses his condition. But it took a parent with the will to succeed and the will not to fail. And that's what we need more in this country. We need more people who don't just sit down and submit to the medical model whenever they tell them, take some pills, take some Zoloft, take some ADHD meds, you know. Oh, it's only worth billions of dollars now. Well, it's not a great story. It's a horrible story, but the fact that you're getting this information out there is great. We're going to have you on. We're going to go interview in the big studio in a second, Ella Grace, and talk more about this. So we'll be right back. Infowars.com. You know, this song is based off a real person who, Marine, who's one of the Marines who brought the flag up, I think, in Iwo Jima, that famous photograph. Ira Hayes is one of the men in there, and he, of course, came back home and fell into depression and alcoholism and ended up dying in a ditch. But going back to this page I pulled up, immed.org, in the case of prisoners as experimental subjects, Texas has a long history of using prisoners in clinical trials. According to the minutes of the Texas Department of Corrections Board, selected prisons in East Texas were used for experiments that were conducted using various mycoplasma species to determine their pathogenicity and countermeasures against infection. This likely resulted in the spread of mycoplasma illness from prisoners to guards and other prison employees to their immediate family and members in the community. All right, we just had our guest on, Ella Grace, and during the break, Nico brought in the patent for pathogenic mycoplasma, which they patented it back in 1993. Of course, they were probably using it before that, but there's the patent up there. So there it is in triplicate, people. Anyway, we're going to do an extended interview with Miss Ella Grace here coming up in a second.